Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Hello. It's so wonderful to be among you again. It's been a while since I've been able to join this esteemed group of well-educated and committed people. I'm so delighted to be here with you today to talk about this exhibition, about which I'm also really excited, World War I and the Rise of Modernism. How many of you have had a chance to take a peek, walk through just quickly? Oh, all of, okay, great, okay, good students, taking advantage of that right off the bat. It's been really gratifying, I will say, that to see the kind of attendance and the kind of attention that our visitors are paying to this exhibition. Our daughter was home from LA over the holidays and came over one day specifically to go to the Plains Indian exhibition and just popped up to see what it looked like in there. And it was shoulder-to-shoulder people, and they were reading and they were looking carefully. And then the next day we came back again specifically to see the World War I exhibition, and it was the same thing. I had not anticipated that there would be such intense interest in the exhibition, and I'm so happy to see that. And I don't know that that will continue because of course it was the holiday season when all visitors were in town and so forth, but it's great to see interest in this exhibition. To start off, I'll just tell you how this all began. You know, of course we were all thinking, gosh, we've got, oop, wow. World War I, a centennial would be coming up, started to think a little bit about would there be any opportunity to do anything, but just that was more just sort of chatter behind the scenes. And then the World War I Museum got us involved. They brought together, of course, as the #1 center for the celebration or commemoration, really is more appropriate, of the centennial of World War I. They saw themselves, and rightly so, as the centerpiece for anything that would happen in Kansas City surrounding this subject. And so they brought together people from the various arts and cultural organizations throughout Kansas City, and we had a big conversation around a very, very large table about what we might do together. Of course, they knew that they would be focusing on activities beginning in 1914 and running all the way through the end of the war, the actual on-the-field war in 1918, and I'm thinking that they're even going to go up to the signing of the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. I'm not positive of that. But they're doing, in addition to their regular exhibition that is always installed, they are doing a series of smaller focused exhibitions upstairs. I hope you've had a chance to see. The first one was called Over by Christmas, because when the war broke out, there was definitely a feeling that this was just a minor thing. It wasn't going to last very long, and people thought it would be over in the fall. It started in the summer of 1916, and they thought for sure it would be over by the fall, and 1914, excuse me. And then when it went on beyond the fall, they thought, well, definitely it's going to be over by Christmas, definitely over by Christmas. And then it went on for 4 years. So it was not what anyone anticipated. How many of you, by any chance, were here the other night to hear Michael Nyberg speak, the great historian of the war itself, and a brilliant mind who has dissected all the literary readings on the subject and who has made sense of it all, because of course there are many different vantage points and many different opinions and many different theories and so forth, but he was an amazing speaker. We have been on the same panels on several occasions and are on the advisory committee for the World War I Museum still. So it was great to have him here. I'm glad that you had the opportunity to hear him. What our job was, and as we sat around the table with the World War I Museum leaders, and talked about how the Nelson Atkins might participate, or how all of the organizations in the city might participate. We each decided we couldn't obviously do something for 4 straight years in this museum, nor could anyone else, but we decided on various moments where we would focus, and this we started to think about really the 2014, therefore, centennial year, the beginning of the war, as that moment where we try to do as much as possible. So those of you who may have symphony tickets know that this season, the symphony is focusing, it's not exclusively focusing on, but it is definitely emphasizing modern music. And in February, the Lyric Opera will be presenting Silent Night, which is an operatic version of the Christmas Truce, which happened in that first Christmas of 1914 during the war. And then there'll be rollouts of lots of things, so just stay tuned and you'll see lots of activities by various arts organizations. The Kansas City Repertory Theater is not doing a specifically World War I related play, but it is doing a play about war called An Iliad. So really, in a sense, I think, I haven't read the play, but I'm assuming it's a kind of conversation about the timelessness of war, that we seemingly can't get beyond those kinds of horrors. So our part of this whole project really is to look at the art, and the title of this exhibition says it all, World War I and the Rise of Modernism. The difference between the 19th century and the 20th century, as I'm sure you know, was like night and day, really. Of course, there was a kind of even moving into from one, just as there was as when we transitioned into the new millennium here. But this was a moment of great change when all sorts of structures began to fall apart from the 19th century, authoritarian structures in politics, in leadership, in even the way that arts education happened. The academies began to fall apart, and new kinds of, basically it was a freedom movement. And if we think of where Europe was in 1914, and we think that our own revolution happened in 1776, and the structures of authoritarian monarchies were overthrown here in 1776, and it's now 1914, and there still is the king and emperor of England, and the Kaiser and emperor of Germany, and the Tsar or emperor of Russia, and the Austro-Hungarian rule, and all of those things, those same authoritarian structures were in place. And this movement toward freedom and liberation was happening in everything. It was happening in the arts, it was happening in the culture, it was happening in politics and everywhere else that you look. So that's kind of what we're looking at, and that is what modernism means, in a sense. A new way of looking at the world, which emphasizes the individual and the rights of the individual, and the independent points of view and expressive capabilities of the individual. So we're going to be looking at that today. A look at the maps before and after of Europe are quite telling. Look at the spread of the Austro-Hungarian Empire on your left. And then look over on the right at how things got, look at how small Austria suddenly got. Look at Germany's reach. Things changed, new countries were born. And in fact, people would argue that we're looking at, today, we're still living out the heritage of World War I with what's happening in the Balkans and what's happening in the Middle East. But before the war, just to remind you, people were traveling freely among all of Europe. So Juan Gris and Pablo Picasso came from Spain to Paris. Kandinsky, seated in the center here, came from Russia to Munich. Paul Klee moved to Munich also from Switzerland. From the United States, Albert Bloch came to Munich. Hugo Ball and Emmy Hennings went from Germany to Zurich in Switzerland. And Mary Wigman, the famous expressionist dancer, also from Germany to Switzerland. From Austria came Raoul Hausmann on to Berlin. Arnold Schoenberg and his family to Berlin from Austria. Just a sampling of the kind of freedom of movement that people had across borders, and the interaction that was happening between musicians, literary personalities, writers, theater people, the ballet, all kinds of things, artists. Everyone was in motion, and they were gravitating towards centers like Munich, like Berlin, like Paris, as exemplars of a great freedom of a liberated spirit in the new arts. This exhibition then examines that whole aspect of World War I. It's divided into 3 sections, and this, by the way, is not the very final layout. There were some minor changes, but we weren't able to get that final diagram imported here. But basically, this is what it looks like. So over on the left, we have the before section, before the war. In the middle, we have the during the war section. And over here, we have the after the war section. So there's a real progression in how you would want to move through it. You don't have to move it through that way. You can go any way you want, but most people will choose to do that. This is a very interesting configuration gallery, P34 and P31, because there are 3 entrances into this space, one from Sculpture Hall, 2 from that north corridor. And so we had an extra challenge, which was to think about how to enter and how to cue people to where they are. So there's an intro text and floor plan at all 3 entrances, so that if you are coming, let's say you approach it from this direction and you see that you are standing at the end of the exhibition, you might want to go through it backwards. That could be interesting. But maybe you might want to start over here at the very beginning, or start here and go through the beginning into the before section, so that you have a sense of the chronology of the war. I think it is instructive to go into it in the middle or to go into it at the end, but for I think your purposes, the best way to start is at the beginning and move through. So I'm not going to talk about each of these things here, but we'll start talking about the individual works as we go through this exhibition. But modernism, of course, was well underway by the time World War I erupted in the summer of 1914 in response to the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who was the heir apparent to the Austro-Hungarian throne in the future. Nobody at the time, those of you who were here the other night and heard Michael Nyberg talk about this, will remember that no one ever could have imagined that that assassination of that person would have, and his wife, Sophie, would have ended up in a world conflagration, the world's first conflagration, worldwide conflagration of this sort. But it did, and no one could really believe it. And what Michael dissected were all of the various theories of how it could have happened and how ultimately, surprisingly enough, it did happen. So the first part tells that story of what was going on with modernism. There was definitely a sense by the later part of the 19th century and moving into the 20th century that things were changing and that culture was changing along with them. It was a radical transformation from moving from an agricultural society to an industrial society, people flooding into the cities to take these industrial jobs. In the cities, they did not have their communities anymore. They were alone in the cities. They sometimes would find people, but they basically came as individuals or as tiny little groups, 2 or 3 friends or something like that, coming to the cities to get jobs in the cities. The cities then became kind of dark and polluted because of the industrialization that was happening. And if you go to the Christmas Carol every year at the Repertory Theater, you know that's the world of Dickens, that world of transition to an industrial economy when people are just cogs in the machines, in a sense, and not individuals who have validity and meaning within a culture of people who care about them. You're on your own, the alienation and all of those kinds of characteristics and qualities that we now associate with the modern condition were coming into play at this point. The art academies were falling apart, and people were not wishing to follow academic rules that called for ultra-realism and idealism, but to really try to reflect and capture something about what this world of the modern was about. So that's where the beginnings of the story starts. And then during the war, of course, everything changes. Some of the artists are called up. In fact, most of them were called up. Some serve, some die, some are wounded, some are mentally, we would call it PT, post-traumatic stress order today. Then they just called it shell shock or mental collapse. They had different names for it. So that was that part of the war. And then after the war, well, the world could never be the same after a war like that. So how do you put the pieces back together and where do you go from there? So let's walk through it and talk about those questions before the war. This is a key work of art. Most of the collection, I forgot to tell you this. The reason that this exhibition is almost entirely drawn from our own collection is because this conversation with the World War I Museum happened very late in the game. You know, we plan 5 to 7 years out for a big exhibition in the featured exhibition spaces. And when this idea came up and we began to really think about it 2 years ago, there was initially the thought, well, missed the boat on that one. We can't do that. We don't have any time. We can never pull something together like that. And then I said, could we do it with our collection? Could we do a smaller version? Could we do something with our collection? And we could. And so we did. But there were a few works that are on loan to us, graciously on loan to us. And this was a piece that I desperately wanted. You know, we have a great Kandinsky, and you'll see in a little while that Kandinsky in case you don't remember it. But it's a late Kandinsky. It's a Kandinsky from when he was working at the Bauhaus. But I really wanted an early Kandinsky because it represents Kandinsky before the war, 1909 and 10, when he is envisioning what he called the new coming spiritual era. That's what was anticipated, a new spiritual era. And in this painting, he captures that quality. First of all, he's painting in a very expressionistic style, as you can see. And he was a leader of the Blaue Reiter, der Blaue Reiter, the Blue Rider. And you see the Blue Rider here. Here's the rider. Here's this kind of horse, and it's leaping over. Over on this side, on the left, is this kind of dark, apocalyptic, dark side, graveyard and so forth, and people looking with their heads down, but one arm up. And then the rider on the horse, and there's a transition over into a kind of rainbow world of a cathedral sort of form that looks like a cathedral stained glass window, and people in action, in motion. And so there's a movement from darkness into brightness in this painting. And I really, really wanted this painting from the Guggenheim, and it was a long time coming, but we finally got it. And I think thanks to Julian, having once worked at the Guggenheim, and also to our very close familial connections with several people who work there, we did get this painting, and I'm so happy to have it. It signals for me just that hopefulness for what the world could be. And then we fall into the reality of what the world became. Kandinsky did come from Moscow. He was trained as an attorney. He worked as an attorney. He discovered it wasn't really his calling, that his calling truly was art. He had an aunt who lived in Munich. He decided that would be the place to go, and he came to Munich, and he found like-minded individuals, Franz Marc, Paul Klee, Gabriele Münter, and Mariana von Berewskin, and others, who grouped together and formed what they called the Blue Rider. And that title really comes from Kandinsky, the idea of blue as a spiritual color, and this idea of the rider, of moving forward into time, into a new world order. And his book concerning the spiritual in art, I'm sure most of you know that book, or know of it at least, was written just before the war and a little bit during. So a very important painting. When the war broke out, by the way, as an enemy alien, since Russia was at war with Germany, Germany was at war with Russia, he had to leave Munich. So there's a moment here where there's a transition. He first goes to Sweden, and then he goes back to Moscow. And then we'll see how Moscow affects him later. When we put this together, this exhibition together, when I had this idea that maybe we could do it with the permanent collection, I knew we couldn't do anything with just the modern collection. So we got the other curators together. So working with me on this exhibition, Catherine Footer in decorative arts, April Watson in photography, Stephanie Knapp in American art. Who have I forgotten? Anybody? I think that's it. So all of us working together really, and in terms of selection, I was the lead curator, so organized and put the whole thing together, but they were all responsible for helping make suggestions for what should be in this exhibition. So as you know, every exhibition that happens here is a very intensely collaborative project, but this one was even more so because we usually don't have all the curators working on the same project. So I wanted to show what the world looked like before the war, so elements of decorative arts. this fantastic sculpture by Ernst Barlach, which is really about revolution, because there were lots of sparks of revolution that had already begun to occur throughout Europe in these years, that were then kind of shut down. And this is really about one of those. It's called Frenzy. Very blocky, heavy, didactic kind of sculpture, of force with its dynamism and its diagonal structure, but the compression of the figure and the solidity of the figure and the strength of the figure are all conveying that notion that the people are rising up. Emil Nolde, major German expressionist artist, who's from the northern, very northern part of Germany, practically in Denmark, the very, very northern tip of Germany. And in this painting, or excuse me, this print, that's the other thing, we pulled from prints and drawings and really mixed up the media in this exhibition so that we could tell the story. And it really is a story to be told. This, this etching of, and dry point of the port at Hamburg, the North Port on the North Sea of Germany. This port here in this atmospheric condition, very sketchy, very alive, very different from the way you think of Emil Nolde, except for the expressionistic gesturing here, but a very atmospheric print. I wanted this here because it's an interesting thing to think about after the war. This is where all the German ships were quartered once Germany began to see it was failing the war. And almost all of those ships from Germany were then part of the Treaty of Versailles and the reparations that Germany had to make. And those ships mostly were divided up among other countries, the winning side. So important to think about the role of Hamburg as the port city for those warships that were going out, those submarines that were going out during the war, and destroyed the Lusitania, for instance, with submarine warfare, the U-boat, Unterseeboot, and then those ships that were there were given to other countries after the war as part of the reparations. Egon Schiele, an Austrian artist, served in the war, and once he finished serving in the war, he went back to Vienna, where he and his wife, who was pregnant, all died of the Spanish influenza. So the Spanish influenza, this is an interesting little sidelight here. We've always heard it, I mean, you've probably all heard it called the Spanish flu, right? Do you know how it got the name the Spanish flu? It was not a flu that was particular to Spain or that started in Spain or anything like that, but nobody else, no other countries wanted to talk about it. They wanted to diminish the scare of this international flu that was floating about. And so no one printed about it, no one talked about it, it was a hush-hush subject. The only papers that published anything about the flu were in Spain. And Spain then became associated with the Spanish flu, even though it had nothing to do with the flu itself. It just was the only country that was courageous enough to share the information and publicize it. In any case, Egon Schiele, we all know him as someone who was especially interested in a kind of new eroticism in art. Not that eroticism is brand new in art, but his way of approaching it was new because of the partially clothed figures, because of the intensity with which he drew and the colors he chose to paint with. And this is a beautiful gouache drawing that we have in our collection, one of his girlfriends. This painting, of course, everyone knows, Emil Nolde's Masks. And Emil Nolde, the great expressionist painter, was on a trip at the time World War I broke out. He was on an ethnographic trip that left from Germany, traveled across the eastward across into Russia on the Trans-Siberian Railroad. Eventually, when he reached the Far East, he got on a ship, and he and other people from Germany went on this big ethnographic voyage down into the various colonies that were owned by Germany, New Guinea being one of them. It was called German New Guinea at that time. And along the way, he was collecting ethnographic artifacts, the art, the objects, and the things that he found that were of interest to him, and other people were documenting the languages, and everybody was doing their part to investigate these other cultures. When he got down into near New Guinea, actually he'd been in New Guinea, the war broke out, and everyone was called back, and so he packed up everything in trunks and had them, he thought, sent back, but none of it made it back. All of it was lost. So that whole venture was lost. However, his interest in those subjects and why he was selected to go on that trip was because of his interest in ethnography. And these masks that you see here, he calls them all masks, but these are all from sketches that he made at the Ethnographic Museum in Berlin, which I've visited, and I've seen these things, and I've seen his sketchbook with his little pencil drawings of these forms, and then it ends up as this painting. Actually, they're not all masks. This one is a canoe prow from the Solomon Islands down by New Guinea. This one is a shrunken head from Peru, and then the others are unidentified masks. People speculate that they're probably carnival masks, Fasching or Mardi Gras masks. Albert Bloch is the only American artist to exhibit with the Blaue Reiter group in Munich. So he came from the United States of German ancestry and then went to Germany, settled in Munich, and was very much an integral part of the Blaue Reiter group in Germany with Kandinsky and Mark and Klee and Jawlensky and all of the others. This is Green Domino. I'm showing you things that you know from our collection, so I probably don't need to say too much about them, but you know that she was a cabaret actress and singer, and this scene is really a part of the Commedia dell'arte tradition coming out of long tradition in Italy and taking its place on the cabaret stages of Germany at this time. It's a combination in terms of the intensity of the color and some of the gestural painting technique of expressionism, but the structure is cubist. So it's this conflation of cubism and expressionism, which we don't always find. Ernst Ludwig Kirchner, Portrait of the Poet Gutmann, more like the Nolde painting, very expressionistic and raw. Very, very powerful gestural rawness to it. The face of the poet, however, is translated in terms of the influence of an African mask, and then the poet carries behind him a Japanese umbrella. So again, it's about this new awareness of the international sphere, the world that is beyond Europe, and bringing all of those things physically and psychologically and artistically into the new world of modernism. Throughout the exhibition, I've created 3 different moments of I call them vignettes, where I combine decorative arts and fine arts in ways that make it feel like a little moment of domesticity. What did life look like at that moment? So in this little moment, we have a chair by Charles Limbert, and you can see this idea already happening of stripping things down to essentials. Before, the 19th century is full of overstuffed, brocaded, heavily decorative sculptural furniture, but the new furniture and the new decorative arts and the new art gets stripped down and essentialized. So verticals, horizontals, minimal decor, no stuffing, just very, very simplistic but beautifully designed. This paired with Juan Grie's book, Glass and Bottle on a Table, where we see a cubist dialogue happening, the kind of thing that would happen at a cafe where someone might be reading a book, or Le Journal, the newspaper, while drinking some absinthe, or in this case, eau de vie, which is just another, this is how the French word for brandy, goblets and things like that. So it's the cafe scene, which we know so much about, which was the centerpiece of life in Paris. And then this samovar by Joseph Hoffmann, part of the Wiener Werkstätte, that is Vienna. Vienna was one of those other great centers for modernism and art and the simplification of forms. And again, think about coffee services and tea services in the years of the 19th century and how elaborate they were in silver. And this one is brass and walnut. Brass is an industrial material. You don't use that for, things on your table until this time. And so very simplified, very efficient kind of design that is stripped down and modern. The Vienna style. Then from that little moment of Expressionism, there's a kind of a transition between, again, this is very expressive in terms of its intensity of color and light and dark and that sort of thing. But here's where you get into a situation where painting doesn't exactly fit into the scheme of things exactly. So de Chirico's Rose Tower here is from 1913, so it's from pre-war. But it was happening in Italy, and of course it becomes really important, his work becomes very important for the Surrealists after the war. But chronologically, it's happening, the painting happens before the war. So I put it here, along with another piece by an artist from Italy, done in 1913 or thereabouts, but a completely different approach. And this is really, this is futurism, which takes cubism and puts it in motion. Cubism is involved with breaking up form and solidifying space, incorporating the idea of space and time continuum, taking their leads from ideas that are being bantered about in the scientific journals, although they're not really scientifically minded, they're gathering bits and pieces of what's out there, what people are talking about, and interpreting it in terms of art. And in this case, Boccioni, in the futurist movement, is really about dynamism and about the future and moving forward. What we're looking at here, it's a little bit difficult to tell, bicyclist. A bicyclist, bicycles were new at the end of the 19th century and into the early 20th century, and speed racing was new. And you think about Italy and France with still today, some of the great bicycles are produced in both of those countries. And this kind of cutting through the solidity of space with the dark lines on the left side and this wedge and this form furiously racing in that direction. By the way, I should say, you may encounter as you're giving tours to people who know something about futurism, and they might say, wasn't he a fascist? And in fact, he was later on a fascist. But once he saw what fascism was becoming, he was a proponent for some of the ideals of fascism, but once he saw what it was becoming, he pulled back from that. But what he really was a futurist, which was, kind of embracing this idea of intensity and violent change, and things needed to happen, and that was where he really stood. So you can temper his, what people will remember about him, that he was at one point a proponent of fascism. Stieglitz, an American photographer who led the whole photographic movement in the United States by opening a little gallery called the Little Gallery of Photography, and it was located at 291. So 291 we tend to think of as its name, Gallery 291. And he published camera work, and he was really the leading U.S. proponent for recognizing photography as an art form. And this is one of his iconic photographs, the steerage. It was a photograph that he took when he was on his way to Germany, or actually just to Europe, I think probably back to Germany, but could be just to Europe. In any case, he was fascinated originally by the differences in who was where. So up here we have the first and second class passengers. Down here we have steerage. These are the people who are going to be traveling in the bowels of the ship the entire trip across the ocean, with periods in time when they can come out and get some fresh air. Up above are the people with the staterooms. Later on, when he looked back at this photograph, he began to talk about it in terms of its cubist structure. And those are also aspects of this photograph and why it is included in this exhibition. Cubism proper, under Georges Braque and Picasso, were the two great inventors of Cubism, as you know. And some people will look at this and just see straight lines and some curved lines, but of course you are all well-versed in helping them understand that this is a bottle, and these are glasses, and this is texture of wood for table, and these are legs of table, and these curves are the edges of a round table. And we're looking at another of those cafe scenes where we don't have any people present in this one, but we see the dynamism of what it means to be in the cafe, drinking, talking, reading the newspaper, and moving about. Life is a world experienced in motion rather than in a static, fixed, still life. And the title, the French word for still life is nature morte, dead nature, which is really interesting because, of course, this is nothing like that. This is everything about motion and activity. Franz Marc, part of the Blau Reiter group, as we've mentioned, here one of his main aspects in his work is the idea that, yes, we are in search of the spiritual in art and revealing it and expressing it, and animals have even higher spirituality than human beings do. They are beautifully spiritual animals, maybe because they lack the overarching spirit of reason that can shut down spirit. In any case, this is a combination of expressionist painting, and it's not a painting, it's actually a drawing, a gouache, but expressionist color and cubist structure, once again. We're combining two different art movements in one. So then we come to during the war, and this painting by Marsden Hartley faces off against the Kandinsky, the early Kandinsky that I showed you, the very first one. So really there's so much, they have so much in common, and yet they're separated by a couple of years in which great things happen. The war breaks out. Marsden Hartley stays in Germany for a while, stays in Berlin, is where he was centered, and eventually comes back to the United States. And you know about this painting, which is such a great painting of explosive energy. On one hand, it's about war. We've got this equestrian figure, this person sort of moving off, all these explosive things happening here and about. But it's also about the lively experience of being in Germany. These have been interpreted as these sugar cones. When I lived in Germany, I discovered these firsthand, that children, when they're going off to first grade, their first year at school, to sweeten the deal of going to school away from home, they get these little cones. Sometimes they're huge cones of candy and games and little toys and things like that to sort of symbolize the fact that they're no longer little children at home. They're now a big boy or a big girl and they're going off to school. But it sort of sweetens that, and these have been interpreted in that way. But the words here, Himmel, which means heaven, and upside down Hölle, H-O umlaut O, L-L-E, are the keys to this painting because it's called Himmel. I always think it should be called heaven and hell instead of Himmel und Hölle, heaven and hell, because really that's what this is about, heaven and hell. It was wonderful being in Germany. It's hell now. The world is coming apart. Also, his romantic life was coming apart. His lover was called up into the German service, and as an American, he eventually had to come back to the US. Cubism, a little moment of Cubism with Alexander Akapenko, a Russian artist who is making this very elegant interpretation of the female body, a bather, traditional image of a female body, but in a very untraditional way. Very streamlined and elegant and elongated. Beautiful form. A photograph by Alvin Langdon Coburn, who was an American photographer, but who was back and forth always between England and the United States. And Vorticism was that movement, not unlike Cubism or Futurism, that was about shattering time and space and shattering the image and dividing and kind of creating that sense of the dynamism of the world that we're living in at this moment in different ways. And for this photograph, it's a very interesting process. He took a whole series of little mirrors and put them together and then put them on the outside of his lens of his camera. So the image that he took is this shattering kind of image of all of those reflections of that mirror. That's what you're looking at here. He didn't take a picture of a diamond or something. It's all the mirrors reflecting upon the mirrors, reflecting upon the mirrors. Like when you stand in front of a mirror with a mirror behind you, often in public restrooms, a mirror in the front and the back, and you see yourself going back ad infinitum to infinity. A fantastic photograph, and we're so glad to have it. Jacques Lipschitz, a very different approach to Cubist sculpture, very blocky and chunky. But again, how do you translate those notions of a figure in motion and not static, a figure in motion and with all of the jutting elbows and shoulders and things like that? How do you translate that into a solid form? Okay, for the painters and for drawing and prints and so forth to shimmer about on the surface of the painting or of the paper, but how do you deal with fragmentation in solid form? I think he did pretty well. You can never really get it completely, but he did indeed break up the figure into its component parts and geometries, with light captured on different parts at different times, depending upon where you stand and where the light is coming from. So it's activated by light and time and space and your own motion around it. Juan Gris, one of my very favorite paintings in our collection, this beautiful painting by Gris, Coffee Grinder and Glass, with its jewel-like colors, which is different from most of Cubism at this time, which was monochromatic and eliminating color because it was all about keeping the tension on the very surface of the picture, whereas color is automatically going to have dimensionality. Warm colors are going to come forward, cool colors are going to drop back in space, and so you really have a push and pull happening between the warm and cool colors in this painting, but the forms themselves are all broken up, and you can see the coffee grinder, you can see the coffee grinder, the goblet, le journal, the drawer of this is where you would, you grind the coffee and then it comes out ground here in this little drawer, you pull it out. Venetian blinds and so forth, and maybe you look out the window. It's hard to say just what we're looking at here, but a cafe scene again, but with brilliant, luscious painting. I once, in a painting class, I just tell you this on the side, we had to, one of the very first assignments when I was an undergrad art major was to paint a copy of something, and I chose a Juan Gris painting, and at the end of the semester we had a big exhibition, and a few days later, my professor called me and he said, "Jan, I have some really great news and I have some bad news." And he said, "What do you want to hear first?" And I said, "Give me the good news." He said, "Someone really loved your painting." I said, "Oh, that's great." I said, "Well, what's the bad news?" "Someone stole your painting." That was funny. So Juan Gris has always had a dear spot in my heart. Sideline. Anyway, moving on. We come then to the during section where things are no longer bright and hopeful, but are in fact grim. And this is Erich Heckel, the German artist who was part of Die Brücke in Berlin. And he served in the war, and here he is. These are not him. He's depicting in a woodcut print what he would see of an officer and a soldier, both wounded in various ways, looking completely despondent. And these would be German soldiers, of course. I have that right next to this, another one of those vignette moments, because I wanted to make a contrast between the reality of the war, which was devastating, deadly, wounding, crushed spirits, violent, and what was happening back in the United States. Remember, we're not in the war yet. We didn't enter until 1917. A domestic, beautiful domestic experience here of this complete set, dresser set by Gorham manufacturers, gilded, exquisite, exquisitely beautiful, right next to what's happening elsewhere in the world. And what was happening in the rest of the world was pretty devastating. I know we all know about this, but it doesn't hurt to see it again. This is a photograph that we borrowed from the World War I Museum, looking at Fort Douaumont and all of the trench. What you're looking at here are all of the trenches. Every time you see like what looks like a river, these are actually where water is collected in trenches. And then all of these pocks are all craters from the bombs. all craters. That's how heavily bombed Verdun was. This part of the war took place in that same site for years, because once the soldiers got entrenched on either side, it was kind of a stalemate. You know, what do you do? Like, if you play chess, what's your next move? What's your next move? It was horrific. And if you can see up here, these are the posts for barbed wire, and that on the other side it would have been, you know, the German side, or whatever. Horrible, 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 horrible. And a new kind of warfare, such that when you're in these trenches and you're standing in water up to your knees, sometimes up to your hips, as it's rained, and these are just reservoirs for mucky water, and the soil is clayish, and you're sinking in, and there are rats, and there are lice, and there are fleas, and there is trench rot. Your feet are rotting, you're freezing cold. During the winter, it continued on and on, all those years. Horrible, horrible. And next to it is this watercolor by Georgia O'Keeffe, painted in 1917, which is why I chose this one, because it was the year that the United States did enter the war. As you probably know, Woodrow Wilson was advocating for involvement, actually after long saying, no, 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 we really can't this is Europe's war, and the American population was saying, this is not our war, we cannot get involved in this is between the European countries, keep us out of it, we do not want to get involved. But eventually we did get involved, and it was 1917. So I thought this was an interesting watercolor to include, because you don't see George O'Keeffe working in this dark, ominous, amorphous color and way very often. And I don't know, I don't have any knowledge of whether this was affected in any way by the fact that the United States entered the war at that moment, but it feels so dark that it just felt like the right piece by her to put in. To think about what the soldiers' lives were like, these are by Steinlen, standing. And these, when I show these side by side, these are works on paper, and they're going to be rotating. So right now the image on your left is on view. Two French soldiers, one's got a cup of coffee, the other's got a cigarette, and they're at ease and talking. And in a few weeks we're going to shift, and it'll just be the single standing soldier. Because of the light exposure, we have to switch them out. So while someone's combing their hair and sprinkling cologne back in the United States using that beautiful Gorham dresser set, these guys are out here doing the dirty work. Back in the United States in 1917, then, when we did enter the war, of course there was a lot of rallying that had to happen. And every single side had to do all sorts of propaganda, posters, to get people involved and excited and ready to fight. So for the United States, it was lots of flag waving and hanging flags from the streets. Oh, they've got they have the wrong titles underneath. We'll have to fix that. The one on the right is Lafayette Street in New York City. And it's when the United States goes into war, and everybody then puts out the national flag. The service flag is the image over on your left, and that is what happens on the home front in the little towns of the United States when all the young men are called up and sent off to war. And then the families, many houses, of course, had the US flag hanging out front as an emblem of their patriotism. But if you had sons in the war, you had a special flag which is called a service flag. And here you see 1, 2, 3 stars. 3 young men from the same family in World War I. That's, hard to really even get your head around, isn't it? That as parents you would send all 3, we don't know how many children they had, of course, but that 3 of your sons would all be going off into this war, and who knew would they be coming home. Other ways in which the drums of patriotism were pounded were by posters and you know, buying war bonds and enlisting and so forth. But this is a really interesting kind of approach. Patriotic emblems embodied by human beings. This is a living flag. In other words, what you're looking at here are people. People dressed in white, people dressed in red, people dressed in blue, and they're all arranged on a big parade ground with someone with a camera way up high, so that by perspective, correcting for perspective. So if you were looking at it on the ground, the flag would be going off like this in the distance, because when you're looking at it in perspective, it has to come into the correct perspective. And then you get this big flag waving image. And there were a number of these kinds of emblems, different sorts of patriotic subjects that were done with living figures. Charles Webster Hawthorne's painting, this is from our American collection, Mother and Child, really a very poignant painting. And without the context of this exhibition, you might not really think of it. You just think, oh, that's a lovely portrait of a mother and her child. But it was 1917 to 20, right in that war period. So thinking about all those adult or young, you know, adolescent and young men who were going off to fight in the war, there also was the sense that parents and mothers in particular were particularly protective of their children. And it's been theorized that this little boy wearing a kind of unusual, kind of army drab color brown uniform, and his mother's look not at him, nobody's smiling, she's not looking out, she's not looking at him, she's looking wistfully off in her own thoughts, that this might be that this probably, in the ominous colors, the darkness, the gloominess of it all, suggests that this is really about this new sense of protectiveness that parents had for their children, and this understanding about all mothers who are losing their children off to this war, mothers and fathers. I paired that with this big poster from the World War I Museum, borrowed from the World War I Museum. Again, it's about the relationship between mother and son, and I don't think anyone would miss the fact that this is a direct play on Michelangelo's Pietà. And the ultimate mother, the Virgin Mother of Jesus, holding her dead son on her lap, and this one, in this case, the Red Cross nurse taking the place of the mother, the loving mother, and caring for the adult sons, but who she's cradling in her arms like a child, but a wounded soldier here, and the Red Cross. So sign up for the Red Cross. Support the Red Cross with your money. Sign up as if you're a nurse, and plenty of nurses did sign up, as you know. Then we get to after the war, and we start to see what I think of as kind of two directions that happen as a result of the war. When you come out of World War I, you've got, on one hand, the Dadaists who are already making art during World War I. They go to, I'll come back to that subject in a minute, but they are in in Switzerland, in Zurich particularly, making art. And then pockets of Dada spring up in different places throughout Europe. And then what that leads into is surrealism. And both Dada and surrealism are about the irrationality of war, about the irrationality of the human spirit. And where does it come from? You know, we tend to think that we're such rational beings, but where is the repository for this irrational behavior? That so-called rational countries, led by so-called rational people, could come to a world at war, going on as long as it did. How could this be? So the Dadaists mocked this irrationality by acting irrationally and acting up. The surrealists, who come as an offshoot out of Dada, are also acting up and acting in irrational ways, but they are also using Freudian psychology to try to plumb the unconscious and figure out what is it in us? And where does this lie, this irrational voice that compels us to do violent things to one another? Okay, all that is preface. So this is Kurt Schwitters, a German artist, and this is one of his Märzzeichnungen. Märzzeichnungen means a März drawing. And the term März, M-E-R-Z, is a term that he found, a word that he found, actually he found it as a word fragment. He was walking down the street and he saw a torn up piece of a bank statement from a bank called Commerzbank. Commerce Bank, not Commerce Bank here. Commerzbank. Commerzbank, but what he picked up was just the M-E-R-Z part, März. And he saw that in his mind, in his heart, as a symbol for the fact that Germany had come apart. In the war, after the war, Germany was shattered. Germany was shattered. It was in tatters. It was, the Treaty of Versailles had really put incredible reparation requirements on Germany. So it was absolutely destitute. People were starving in Germany for years thereafter. Literally, no food, no money to get food. Eventually, they were coming to the bakery with wheelbarrows full of money, marks, to buy a loaf of bread, wheelbarrows full. The German mark fell, related to other currencies, unbelievably. It was worth nothing, nothing. Not the paper it was printed on at all. So what Kurt Schwitters is doing here is commenting on that. This is a Märzzeichnungen, and the title is Man verkauft gern. What that means is 2010, one sells gladly. People sold anything they could possibly sell to anybody who could possibly buy it to try to get money to survive. So what he's found are these little cutouts like coins, and they're about as valuable as the German coin. Nothing. They're worth nothing. And then these rectangular forms are like the German paper money, the Deutschmarks of various increments, also worth nothing. So one sells gladly. Anything that one can sell to survive. Dada, another aspect of Dada, man raised Dada photo. In this case, a combination of an automaton sort of figure, a puppet, a mannequin, which is like a paper doll. You can see the little rivets here at the joints. And then a real human being, a real female woman, standing behind this thing. And it's partly about the dehumanization of human beings. It's partly about what happened to people as a result of the war because they had these artificial limbs. They had been wounded, they lost arms, they lost legs, they lost their faces, they lost their genitals, they lost all kinds of things. Bodies were destroyed, physically destroyed. Prosthetic devices were invented, and all sorts of plastic surgeries were invented really during World War I as a result of trying to fix the horrors, utter horrors that were human lives thereafter. So it looks funny. It looks like a witty comment. It looks kind of funny. If you didn't know what it was about, you'd think it was funny. And that was what I mean. It's sort of mocking, but it's also mourning what happened with the war. Man Ray, an American artist who is working in Paris for a while, and his Dada approach is this object indestructible, where he takes an ordinary metronome purchased at an ordinary music store and attaches to it a cutout. First it was that black and white image of an eye, and it was the eye of a former girlfriend. So he makes her as this Lee Miller's eye, who now just becomes this metronome ticking back and forth. And it's called Object Indestructible, but it was actually destroyed. The first version of it was Object to be Destroyed, and it actually was destroyed. And then he made another version, and then we finally got one, a later version from 1975, which is Object Indestructible. And one of a large edition of that, and so that's in our exhibition as well. It's a winking, and then he appends one of those little winking eyes, you know, that you can just tip and you can make it sort of wink. It opens and closes. Wind it up. I always wanted to wind it up, make it go. I guess I don't know if we can or not. Brancusi was working in Paris at this time. Of course, he's Romanian, but and Romania is where the eastern front of the war was happening, and Russia. But this is Brancusi after the war, portrait of Nancy Cunard, 1925 to 27. Nancy Cunard is of the Cunard shipping line family, very wealthy family, an heiress, and she was living in Paris and was quite the lady about town in Paris in these years. And Brancusi met her only once and was so impressed with her that he made this sculpture of her. She didn't know anything about it until way after the fact, but she was very distinctive in her appearance. First of all, she was always really dressed in a very interesting way. She was very, if you think about being in Paris and the way that Parisian women walk very beautifully and gracefully and with small steps, and she was tall and extremely slender and took very large strides as she walked through the streets, and she had these little curls, these little ringlet curls by the side of her ears, and a very erect posture, extremely erect posture. And so what Brancusi has captured here is the erectness of her body. He turned those little side curls into a chignon to capture that sort of insouciance of her personality. She also had a very prominent forehead and a very receding chin, which he just made into one curve, and was very, very slender. So all of those attributes of her he captures, but it doesn't look like her, but if you saw her, you would say, Nancy Cunard. There's Brancusi in his studio, photographed by the American photographer Edward Steichen, again from the late 20s. So now the world is back in motion and people are going back and forth between countries again. Marcel Duchamp, oh boy, where do you start with him? French, comes to the United States, really makes it big in the United States as part of this avant-garde circle in New York City. His brothers and sister were artists in France, and he didn't fit in with that world and came here and definitely fit in, but was eternally French at the same time. We know about Marcel Duchamp and his ready-mades, the idea of selecting, that to be an artist doesn't mean to create and make from nothing. It can also mean to select things and put in contexts whereby something ordinary becomes a work of art. So this is his collection of all of the things. It's basically his life's work, which he then created facsimiles of and packaged in a little suitcase, which he called the traveling salesman, as if you would, like a traveling salesman, open up your suitcase and show your wares. And so he was kind of making fun of all of that. But it really is, you know, the passage of the Virgin, passage of the Bride, and so forth, the chocolate grinder, the air of Paris, where he took a little vial and just sealed it up with a Bunsen burner, and he has air of Paris captured in there, a tiny version of a typewriter, a comb, all kinds of things that are hat racks, bottle rack, whoops, there it is, bottle rack, all these things that he's just made. This one, I want to call your attention to. It's his most famous, the urinal. You probably know about this one, that as the legend has it was submitted to the Society of Artists, and it was rejected from this exhibition. That they said they were going to accept everything would be accepted, and that was rejected. There is new scholarship out. It's been out, it's been circling around for quite a while in the background. Did he really do that? Did he really do that? And now there seems to be a little more evidence that he did not do that. That in fact, Else von Freytag Loringhofen did it. A German baroness actually did that, and that she then denied it, but then he eventually picked up and said he did it. And so that question is now out there again, and scholars are going to be trying to finally settle who, in fact, did submit the urinal. It was called Fountain, by the way, when the title on the piece when it was presented was Fountain. Oh, I should say that I installed this, and maybe some of you had a look at it. I installed it so that when you look through the large glass, which huge, this is huge, the real large glass is huge. It's at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. But when you look through the large glass in our little version here, what you see is this. And this is the big surprise that we've got Monet in this exhibition. I think people are going to be, what? Why is Monet in this exhibition? Well, Monet was working on this painting, in fact, not just this one, but the entire Water Lily series from 1915 through 1926. So while the war was going on, he is at Giverny. He is painting all of these water lily images, these beautiful, placid, peaceful, gorgeous, lovely, lovely, huge paintings. He's painting them. And I looked on the map and really did the kind of calibration, and it looks like at the closest that the German lines came, that is where the front was, on the western front, it was about 60 miles from Giverny, which means that he very likely could hear bombs going off, the wind was right, that sort of thing, definitely could have heard some sounds. His son and stepson were in the war. He, of course, was too old to serve. But he felt this so deeply, and he communicated in letters with Georges Clemenceau, who went on to become, Georges Clemenceau was the leader of one part of the French forces, and later on became the prime minister or premier of France. Communicated back and forth with him, and the correspondence is fascinating to read, but he talked about continuing to work, because people wanted him to get out of there and go to Paris, because who knew where that line was going to, how far south that line of battle was going to come. And he said, he wrote back and he said, no, they're going to have to come and kill me in front of all my work, my life's work. And he stayed at Giverny the whole time. And then when the war was over, he gave the entire suite, as you probably know, he gave the entire suite of the water lilies to the French nation as a gift of peace. And they were installed, and where they still are today, in the Orangerie, which is near the Tuileries, near the Louvre. All in the name of peace. So, to backtrack a little bit, coming out of Dadaism then comes Surrealism. And Surrealism means above reality, higher reality. And that's what they were seeking, some higher reality, but at the same time, they were plumbing the depths, thanks to Freud, plumbing the depths of human psychology through dreams, through automatic drawings, through all kinds of ways, through drugs, all sorts of ways in which they thought they could and did access parts of the human experience that was not censored by the rational brain. What's underneath, and depicting in their art and in their writings the world that they experienced that was irrational or a higher reality. This is Yves Tanguy at the Risk of the Sun. Looks very stony and sculptural, as if you could just reach out and grab it and take it up, but in fact, of course, it's all invented. What is it? Parts of animals. You see different kinds of things in it. It's also about what do you see in things. So maybe you see a heart here and a heart there. Maybe this resembles a face. Maybe this is some kind of an animal, some kinds of another animal, an elephant maybe. Or you start to see things in it, and this comes out of this idea of automatic drawing. Close your eyes, let your mind wander, and then open your eyes and see what you can find in the picture. We all did this as kids. It's like a children's game. And then they had another game, the surrealists, called Exquisite Corpse, where you start with, Exquisite Body, where you start with a folded piece of paper, kind of fan folded, and somebody would start at the top, looking at just this much, and would start making something, let's say a head, and then would fold it over, and the next person would just see the two lines where that stopped, and would continue with that, and would be with whatever, and you'd keep folding it and unfolding, and then when you open the whole thing up, you'd see this whatever, exquisite corpse. So that was one of the games they played, and as I said, lots of ways to liberate the higher reality from the conscious reality. In these eternal, infinite, no space, all space kinds of settings. Kay Sage, American artist who goes to France, actually ends up marrying Yves Tanguy, and you can see that same kind of quality here. That space, no space, what are we, where are we, what are these things, non-real but evocative of the real, evocative of a figure perhaps in a skeletal structure, evocative of landscapes but also evocative of books and pyramids and all sorts of things, and everything kind of comes together to create an alternative reality. Jean Arp, making these organic sculptures that are, again, have reference to the figure perhaps, but also maybe to some kind of a vehicle with a wheel, mergers of things, and in this case, this beautiful polished copper which reflects and adds another dimension of things that get larger and smaller, and we all love to play those games in front of the Millennium Bean. Up in Chicago, people love to play those games. It's like that, only this was the predecessor for it. And then there's André Masson, who really addresses the whole notion of violence here. This one's called Le Petit Tragédie, the little tragedy. Well, it's really about the war, and what we're looking at here is a kind of beast-headed human figure carrying a dagger and a firebomb, and another figure leaping in, about to crush the face of this figure, and things falling apart in every direction. And the colors that he uses, red and green, contrasting, not just contrasting, but they're complementary colors, but putting together, they clash and they vibrate together. So he's using everything at his disposal to convey the violence of what was the war. And then we have this in the midst of it again. I want to come back to it so you can just settle in and look at that up close. And it's framed, so that moment of utter peace and utter beauty, and there's a bench in front of it as there should be so that you can contemplate that. But on the left side, a reminder of the war, that peace happened in the middle, at Giverny, while the war was happening, while Käthe Kollwitz's son Peter was killed in the war. While after the war in Germany, people went with buckets of money to buy a loaf of bread, and we see this sunken-faced woman with her tiny little emaciated child. We see all of the wounded veterans trying to peddle and beg on the streets of the city. And we see the Prussian officer coming through here with his little pointy head. That's the Prussian helmet. We see a worker looking for work. Everything comes apart in Germany. Total collapse in Germany. Which is why the war ended in 1919, and in 1919, 1921, Adolf Hitler became the leader of the German Workers' Party, and eventually, that is the NSDAP, the Nazi Party gets shortened to Nazi Party, and eventually becomes the Chancellor of Germany, and eventually we have World War II. It doesn't end with World War I. As I said, some people see it as one big continuum to now. On the other side, Ernst Barlach's Ruin, a kind of emblematic image of a continent in ruin. The continent as this block of stone with a weeping woman at the top and a man, with a bearded man with two children perhaps huddled below. A world destroyed in ruins, Europe in ruins. Otto Dix, these two are going to rotate, that's why I'm showing them together. The barricade revolutions ensued after the war as well, so we have a soldier and a businessman on the barricades fighting. And over on the right, corpses before burial at Tahur. These are reflections on the war and reflections on what happened immediately thereafter. But you know, when the war took place, you couldn't go out into the no man's land between your trench and the opposition's trench, because number one, there was all that barbed wire, but number two, the minute you stuck your head up out of the trench, the machine guns zapped you. So there were so many facial destructions. Heads blown off. Franz Marc, I always read that he was killed at Verdun. Franz Marc was killed at Verdun. I just imagined he was shot. He had his head blown off. Ugly. So you couldn't go out and you couldn't recover the corpses. You couldn't recover the bodies. And so they laid out there and rotted. It was horrific. Georges Rouault, these are going to rotate again as well. War's Dread of Mothers on the left. Rouault, as you know, very spiritual, very powerfully spiritual. So these have the quality of stained glass windows, but in black and white. And over on the right, Mortality Hath Her Tears. The Messenger. It's related to classical literature, but at the same time, it's about who has to deliver these messages to those who have lost husbands, brothers, children. Beckmann, Night. This is about the war and the aftermath thereof, which was revolution, because it wasn't finished. And the horrors, the rapes, the violence, the torture, the things that happened as Europe tried to right itself were unspeakable. Kokoschka, looking back at the war, although this is actually right during the war, 1918, the principle. What he's taken is the idea of the ennobling busts of heroes. He's taken that idea, but he's transformed it into this bloody, wounded bust, and he writes liberty, wait a minute. What does it say there? Liberty, equality, and fratricide. So it's a play on liberty, equality, and fraternity, which was the motto of the French Revolution. Red, white, and blue, the colors of the Allies, the French, the German, and the French, the British, and the Americans, red, white, and blue. He incorporates all of that, and it's a bloody mess. Paul Klee, now, this is the other side. If surrealism is exploring the unconscious, irrational forces that cause us to have these wars, and then we saw the war itself surrounding the peace, then there is what happens on the other side after the war as an opposition to what the surrealists were doing, was what the Bauhaus was doing, because no sooner had the war ended than the Bauhaus opened at Dessau in Germany as a way to rebuild, I shouldn't say rebuild, I should say to build anew, to create a new something. And so among the artists who were eventually called to the Bauhaus, Walter Gropius was the director, he was an architect, and he was the founder, and he brought in a group of faculty members, and then the faculty expanded, and Paul Klee eventually was added to the faculty. And this is a wonderful, and now, post-war, 1922, and in fact, it's in memory of a particular day, October 5th of 1922, which was the date of a faculty meeting that was held at the Bauhaus, in which there was all kinds of arguing and biting at each other, and he likened this to a scene from Mozart's opera, and so that's what you're looking at here. He was never one to be didactic. It was always metaphoric with Paul Klee, and kind of appearing whimsical, but with serious subject matter. Laszlo Moholy-Nagy also coming to the Bauhaus, teaching photography, but not straight photography, not pictorial photography, but photography that could happen with or without a camera. In this case, without a camera, where you lay your face on the underneath the, what's it called, the light. Just forgot the name. Anyway, you lay your head on the printing table, where normally you'd have a piece of paper. You've got your piece of paper. You lay your head down, shine the light on it, and you create a photographic image. And so that's what these are: self-portrait lighting a cigarette. Photograms. Any photograph that's not made with an actual lens camera is a photogram. Lionel Feininger, American artist also who of German heritage, but is called to the Bauhaus and teaches at the Bauhaus. And we're looking here at one of his paintings, very prismatic, very much about Cubism, but more defined than the total fragmentation that Cubism at its height represented. But he would go out into the countryside from first from Weimar. Weimar was the first Bauhaus, and then later they moved to Dessau. And this is from that earlier period into the countryside, the little villages. This now is from the Dessau Bauhaus. So this is from the later stage of the Bauhaus. And this is, a design for new living, really stripping down. We saw that chair earlier on, but this is really stripped down chair and made with industrial materials so that it can be industrially produced. Doesn't have to be made in a workshop. This is something that machines can do. So therefore it can be made cheaply, efficiently, in mass production, and then people can buy these chairs. Now, of course, these chairs are very expensive to buy. These are designer items today, but in their day they were ultra cheap compared to what a very heavily upholstered, brocaded chair would have cost. Kandinsky at the Bauhaus. So Kandinsky, as I mentioned, when the war broke out, had to go back to Russia, went back to the Soviet Union, well, to Moscow, and then the Russian Revolution happened in 1917 while he was there, and then he was caught up in all of that, and then he was caught up into all of the revolutionary new ways of teaching art and making art, including the Vuktemus and other organizations where he became connected with them. And so you think of Malevich and other artists of the Russian constructivist movement and the suprematist movement of Russian art. And he comes back to Germany now to teach at the Bauhaus, but instead of his organic, fluid subject matter, expressive gesture, it's very much influenced by the Russian sensibility of constructivism. Although the color symbolism is there, and his synesthesia, that is, when he saw color, he heard sound. When he heard sound, he saw colors. So those kinds of multiplicities of experience are also present here. This is simply called Rose with Gray, but what a dynamic image of poise and balance and unbalance. Feels like a world coming apart, and maybe that was part of his intention. I think that could be a little bit reading too much into it, but there certainly are forms that are lightning-like and sword-like and explosive-like, but at the same time there's balance and rainbow and order. So all of those things are somehow brought together here. And then in terms of decorative arts, as well as the chair that we just saw, a tea set. Now this could never have happened in the 19th century. This is taking the principles of constructivism and paring things down to essentials. The circle, the square, the triangle. Those are the forms that are taught at the Bauhaus, at De Stijl in the Netherlands, and in the constructivist and suprematist movements in the Soviet Union. The cone, and you can and then put them into 3 dimensions: the cone, the cylinder, and the sphere. A tea set, teapot with lid and a tea cup and sugar, probably. So beautiful. Made originally all handcrafted as silver, but put into production. You could get the silver version for expense, or you could get the stainless steel version for less. There is our brochure, which you can recognize the Alvin Langdon Coburn photograph on the cover, and the dynamic structure of our designers, our wonderful designers. None of this happens, I'm talking about it, but we're all working on these projects. This is completely collaborative. Shirley Harriman was our designer for the brochure. All of the curators, as I mentioned, proposed works from their collection that could be in the exhibition from which I selected. And then we have our designers. This was Shirley again, who designed the laminate material. I did the texts and so forth, but she did the design. We've got also a wonderful timeline with this exhibition. And Adrienne Lally Hills was our designer, or excuse me, the interpretive specialist that worked with me on this exhibition. Such great teamwork. It's just a thrill to be able to work with so many people who are so good at what they do and make it all come out like this. So this is the timeline where we combined both art events and historical events. And so we could really see how before, during, and after looked in just a snapshot. Obviously, this is not the whole story, but it's a snapshot. And then we also called out 6 individuals whose lives were particularly impacted by the war. So Albert Bloch was, as I said, living in Germany, living in Munich at this time, and he writes at this point, "I am pure despair. The thought that wife and child could go hungry, that's how destitute things were getting in Germany," so he had to come back to the United States. Claude Monet, a mad panic has possessed all this area. I prefer to die here in the midst of my work rather than save myself. That's what I was alluding to earlier. Kirchner, what is the purpose of all this hideous brutality? Käthe Kollwitz, it's as if the umbilical cord were being cut all over again, the first time into life, the second into death. Franz Marc, who died at Verdun, wrote this before he died, obviously. Death leads us back into normal being, whatever that is. Egon Schiele, what can one say about the war? Every hour it continues is a shame. There we are. We went over, I went over, I apologize for that. But and I understand that we can take groups. Where's Marla? There's Marla. Marla, how do you want to do this? Should we do some groups at this point? Mm-hmm. Okay. Yes? Oh, I'm glad you asked about the music. I wanted there to be music because I wanted it to be about more than just, I really wanted it to be about all the arts. So painting, sculpture, photography, decorative arts, prints, drawings, all of it. And then I love music so much. And I thought, wouldn't it be, and because also, of course, the symphony is working on this program, or has developed this program for the symphony year, and I have season tickets to the symphony, and so I already knew what their program was going to be, but I thought, wouldn't it be great if we could bring music into this exhibition? So I created the playlist for what is in the exhibition, but Adrienne did the logistical stuff, and with some IT help, put the thing together, but I created the playlist, and it's just soft, it's kind of in the background so that it's there, but it's not overtly there. You listen to it, but you don't have to pay attention to it. We started out with a bigger playlist. We winnowed it down because we didn't want it to be too big and too long. Also, I had to leave out Stravinsky's Rite of Spring, which I heard, I've never heard it performed live until this Saturday night when the symphony performed it. Oh my God, I thought I was going to leap out of my seat. It was so incredible. But if you know the piece, it goes along and then it's just boom, boom, boom. And we couldn't have that. So we had to eliminate Stravinsky's Rite of Spring from the playlist and have it be more of a kind of softer background quality. But I'm glad you brought that up because that was an important point that I wanted to be part of it. Any other questions before we? Mm-hmm. Oh, that Kandinsky painting is from the Guggenheim Museum. The wooden chair that I showed you at the beginning is from a private collector. The poster of the world's greatest mother, the Red Cross, and the photograph of the trenches at Fort Douaumont are both from the World War I Museum. Everything else is ours. Huh? It was my first purchase when I became the curator. We don't get to show it that often because it's, it's very fragile. One more question?
Could you give me a definition of modernism?
It's one of those terms that's really hard to define, but I would say it has to do with, Modernism is the movement or the shift in cultural understanding that happens as a result of industrialization, speed, and the rise of the individual as opposed to community. You know, if you're living in small towns or in villages or on farms, your community, and it becomes more about the individual. Liberation, it's a liberation movement, really, in terms of the arts and culture as well. Anything else? Okay, well, I will meet you back here, and I can take one group through and then another group if you'd like, or however you'd like to do it.